Week on Make Better Wealth Decisions, we're speaking with Stephanie Holmes Winton, who is an expert on cash flow planning. Have you ever thought about how you can improve your financial outcomes by giving more consideration to your cash flow planning?
Make Better Wealth Decisions, a podcast that explores how financial advisors' blind spots can harm your investments. I'm your host, John DeGuy, a portfolio manager with Design Securities in Toronto.
This week on Make Better Wealth Decisions, we're speaking with Stephanie Holmes Winton. She is the founder of Cash Flow, which builds tools to help professionals and their clients get more out of life through their money management and their cash flow and debt management strategies. Stephanie's behavior-based approach makes it easier for people to stay on track with their finances and to avoid money mistakes. Stephanie, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, John. I'm excited to be here today.
Super. Let's begin by having you make a distinction. How is cash flow different from budgeting?
Yeah, so the difference is nuanced, but very impactful. So I think a lot of times when people even hear the term cash flow planning, what they think of is budgeting. Almost all people, if you boil it down and ask them how they could better manage their money from month to month, a lot of people will say, well, obviously I should be on a budget or I should make a budget. And the reality is that traditional budgeting is really difficult for human beings to manage effectively. It requires too many categories. Electronic spending isn't very compatible with our traditional idea of budgeting. It does work if we are micromanaging everything, if we're using jars or envelopes of cash, but it's very difficult in our modern society to actually do that. So a budget tends to add everything up and hope there's something left over. And a cash flow plan actually prescribes how much is safe for somebody to spend. When we look at somebody's expenses, we can usually trust the data around things like their mortgage or how much they put in their RSP every month or how much their hydro costs.
Mhm.
But if you examine what somebody might fill out in a budget sheet, for their what we call spendable expenses, they would be those high frequency, high variability, high volatility expenses like groceries and coffee and eating out and kids' activities and the things we do on the weekend. If you looked at somebody's data from that, it's often very inaccurate. So they think they remember what they spend, but the number of transactions that are involved in those types of expenses in a month is very difficult to track. So a cash flow plan splits high risk emotional expenses into their own account with an assigned amount that's safe to spend. And what it does is it focuses the person's energy on just managing one number every single week rather than trying to micromanage a million different little expenses because we are all too busy and too tired and inundated with information all the time. And what we need is more simple ways to manage our money. So a cash flow plan really does that. And it takes some of the traditional experience of pain, discomfort, and overwhelm of budgeting away.
And if you match the the cash flow, see, I almost did it. If you match the cash flow planning to your pay, which I think is the way you would probably try to do it if you're going to put it into chewable chunks, some people get paid 26 times a year, some get paid 52, some get paid 24, some get paid 12. I only get paid 12 times a year, once a month. Does that have an impact on how you do the actual cash flow planning in terms of the micro chopping up of the actual payments that you're getting as part of your day job?
So that frequency of pay is an important factor in calculating income, but it actually becomes irrelevant in calculating that safe to spend number. And what happens is somebody's fluctuating income, even people who are on commission or who have variable income, we can really smooth out the experience of our spending decisions, regardless of when our pay frequency is. So when somebody's got a cash flow plan, we obviously take into account the frequency of their pay at first. But for most people with a cash flow plan, there's what we call money found. So the difference between what we call committed expenses, those are all those bills, those things I said, those are very easy for people to look up and find. The data is
Mhm.
usually accurate. And that prescribed spendable number When we take those two numbers away from income, there's almost always money found. Not in every case. And I will tell you, in the cases where somebody doesn't have money found, what that actually tells us is the expenses that are too high are those committed expenses. It's their mortgage, it's their insurance, it's their bills, it's the things they actually have to make major changes to change. It's not their day-to-day spending that's getting them off track. And in those cases, we have to make bigger changes, or just decide to live with pain. There's not much day-to-day spending is going to change there. But when it comes to that spendable recommendation and frequency, it becomes irrelevant quite quickly because there is money left over and their spendable amount, that safe to spend number, is moved over on a weekly basis into a separate account. It doesn't matter when they get paid once they get through a month or two.
Mhm.
And that really helps because when you look at most people's spending habits, they live in a weekly rhythm. And
Mhm.
if we did this experiment very early on when I created this process with my clients, we did it for quite some time. And what I found is that if we took the spendable money out monthly, people ran out of money quite quickly. It was less than 3 weeks through. The
Mhm.
same amount of money divided into weeks lasts. So that frequency, one of the goals of a cash flow plan is to get rid of the pressure or challenge that frequency could create.
Okay. So one of the things that people like, say, for instance, David Chilton will talk about is the principle of pay yourself first.
Hmm.
And as a person who is a cash flow expert, I'm curious to hear your thoughts and ask you to weigh in on just on the concept, on the principle.
There's nothing wrong with it. It's just an oversimplification. Pay yourself first will only keep you from overspending if you don't have any access to credit and if you have no overdraft. And if you're not carrying any consumer debt. Because I could be paying myself first every single month and ticking that box. I've done it. I'm doing the thing I've been told to do, but I could still overspend. And the
Mhm.
the idea of pay yourself first is that you capture an amount of your salary and you push it out of your reach before you have a chance to spend it and you live on the remainder of your money. But if you're carrying a credit card balance and you pay yourself first by putting some money away in your investments, that doesn't mean that you pay the same amount to the credit card balance that you would have the month prior. So, is it a good principle? Absolutely. If you have no access to any kind of credit or financial flexibility, is it on its own the solution to managing spending? Absolutely not. You
Okay.
can pay yourself first and rack up a ton of debt all at the same time.
So it sounds like even good ideas, that things that make sense in principle, have risks associated with them. And this is a podcast that's all about making better wealth decisions. So I'm wondering if you could perhaps share what you think are maybe some common behavioral tendencies that you see people making on a fairly regular basis that might be characterized as money mistakes.
Yeah, there's a few that really jump out at me as the most common. And I would say the one that I see almost everywhere, and we've seen several studies have shown that the majority of people show this particular bias when they're answering questions about their finances or when making decisions. And the first one is present bias, that tendency to want something right now or soon versus something we can have later.
Mhm.
And the mistakes that leads to is really obvious. A lot of us do it. So that trip down south when we're today in Nova Scotia, we're minus 20 in the wind chill. Now, here we don't even get that cold of a winter. It's cold for a few days and then everything melts. It's not that bad. But in these days, sometimes we see a commercial or there's an ad on our phone and we're like, oh, yeah, being south would be so great. I'm so tired of this winter. And off we go. But what we don't stop to do is think about the consequence of that immediate gratification in our next 30 years. And many times I've asked people if you could take what made up your credit card balance and I could spread it all out on the floor in front of you right now, would you buy all these things again for the same price? I've never had anyone say yes.
Right.
So, present bias is a really big one. And I think sometimes in financial services and in giving people advice, we try to teach people to fight their own instinct, to teach them how to be more rational than their own brain. But as you probably know, we mostly make emotional decisions and then we justify them with ration later.
Right.
And so, what I've learned is if we try to make people fight themselves too much, they just get tired and give up. So, present bias is something, for example, that can be leveraged to help you. Understanding your own behavior is only valuable if you learn how to use it to your advantage, not try to fight it. So, present bias being a factor, setting short term goals associated with behavior changes you're making in your spending or committing to putting money in your RSP or your TFSA is a great way to stay on track. If I am going to manage my spending so I can afford to take my kids to Disney, I'm way less likely to undo my progress in a moment of weakness because I'll be undoing the trip to Disney. And I don't want to do that. And that present bias draw helps us move forward. It has to be something 6 to 18 months out. Any longer, and it's not so effective. It gets a little too long term. So, present bias is a great example of something that drives us mostly to make mistakes, but could be used in our advantage.
So
Another,
with
yep,
regard to present bias, a lot of what I talk about is on the investing side of things. I can't help but think that present bias is the culprit for why most people tend to undersave for their retirement because they're
yeah,
living in the here and now. Do you
yeah.
have any sense on what the numbers are in terms of the number of people that simply from a cash flow perspective undersave for their retirement? And maybe
I
you
can
don't. I
tell
don't know.
you, yeah, I can tell you from our data, the majority, so well over 80% of the people we see come through a cash flow plan are not putting enough away for the future. And we see the majority of people do not have sufficient emergency savings. And anytime we survey people about that or hear anecdotal feedback on it, the thing we hear about emergency savings is I've got cash in my investments. Well, if that's inside of a TFSA or an RSP, it's not emergency savings because it's either holding space in a very tax efficient packet that you could use much better, or it's going to trigger a tax consequence. That's not emergency savings. Emergency savings is, oh no, the boiler died and we can pay for it. So
Right.
we see both the predictable future not funded properly and then the very predictable future. You will get older. We will all get to the point
Right.
where we probably can't work. We see that a lot. And I find that a lot of people have trouble picturing themselves in their future age. Like we just convince ourselves all the time of what that will be like. Well, oh, I'm going to spend so much less when I retire. We have an exercise called the retirement shift worksheet, and I've done it with clients face to face. I've done it as a workshop with groups of people. I've taught it online. We've taught other financial professionals to use it. And when you get people to write down all the things they think they'll spend in retirement and then check off what's going to go up, what's going to go down, what's going to go away, and what's a new expense, you hear a lot of, oh no,
Mm.
I forgot. Like, I didn't think about property tax will go up and this will go
Right.
up. And like, yes, I mean, you're not going to work, but so the only thing that's leaving is the cost of working. Now, if you are contributing a ton to your retirement and you had a big mortgage payment and both of those end on the day you retire, then you have that cushion that you can assume.
Mhm.
But for so many people, a lot of their retirement expenses, they really haven't thought about it. So exercises that can put us in a moment of, okay, I'm there now, and this is what's happened. Oh, this is not quite what I thought about because we think about it so abstractly. Like
Sure.
it's very difficult for us to do. So that's almost like the opposite end of the present bias problem is picturing ourselves in the future.
And as we try to make decisions that will help us stay on track, I'm curious as to your thoughts with regard to a set it and forget it sort of approach. Now, that can be a monthly savings program through a pre authorized
Mhm.
checking program, for instance, into an RSP or TFSA or what
Yeah.
have you. But it can also be something like your monthly credit card bill. For better or worse, I have it set up so that my bill is paid on the day it's due in full automatically. The money just comes from my account. So I don't have to go in and look. The good news is I'm never late in making a payment. The bad
Mhm.
news is there's not as much veracity in checking the line items on my bill as other people might have. So there are pros and cons. I'm curious as to your thoughts.
So, set it and forget it is really useful for things where you might get in your own way. So, automatic saving to your emergency savings, set it and forget it. Absolutely. Automatically putting money into your investments every month, set it and forget it. Absolutely. What you're describing, sometimes we hear credit card companies call it a heap and sweep. It can be an effective strategy. It causes the issue you pointed out where you may not pay as close attention to what you're spending on. And I would add a layer to that. I would not recommend people ever use their credit card for those high risk day-to-day spending activities. That spendable, what's safe to spend amount. One, people are not very good at tracking it. Two, you can't in order to do it properly, you'd have to pull your credit card limit down so low to stay in that weekly limit that you'd actually be damaging your credit. But the other really big problem we have with behavior and spending is we're really influenced by rewards programs, so points programs. And it's really easy to convince us to just put everything on the card. And some people have the financial comfort level and enough cash flow that they could heap and sweep their credit card all day long and it won't hurt them. They'll pay it. It won't send them into, a financial tailspin, but it will likely result in them spending more. Statistically, people spend 15% more when they use a credit card to pay for something than when they use cash or essentially cash from their debit because it often is tied to a much vaster limit. And it's easy for us to overspend by as little as 5% at the checkout. And that ate all your cash back in almost all cases. So, there's all kinds of things we should automate. Most of them, we should automate the things where we get in our own way, where we hesitate. And so heaping and sweeping bills only on your credit card, fine, because that money should be there. But heaping and sweeping the groceries could absolutely result in some
Okay.
error. Yeah.
All right. So you're really good. I can tell just listening to you talking about little hacks that you can use to optimize your decision making to make it work for you, but also work objectively, just as this is just a good thing to do. So I'm wondering if you have maybe one or two things that you can share with regard to these hacks and decision making. What can you do to initiate good financial habits? And on the flip side, what if you have to break bad financial habits? How do you do that?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that can really help is to pick one thing to focus on first. The thing that you have the most immediate control over is your day to day spending. You make a new decision every single time you make the transaction, right? You don't make a new decision every time you pick up your phone and use it. That was an agreement you probably made that is either tied to some sort of phone agreement or something or other that you have to do for a certain period of time, and it might be difficult to undo. But those day to day decisions are actually the ones that you have the most ability to immediately control. So there are many habits that some people want to break. And I hear a lot of times the latte factor and all of these. Well, if you just didn't go out for coffee or if you didn't drink coffee this many coffees over 37 years, you'd have
Yeah.
$1 million. The math's not wrong. It's just not thinking about the human involved. Like most financial wisdom would be appropriate if human beings weren't involved at all. It would all work. And if it all worked, I mean, what would happen? I mean, some other problem would, I'm sure, exist. But things that you can control are the most important things, those student things that you can control. So that separating your day-to-day spending, crucial, not using your credit card for those day-to-day spending, but setting that limit alone will help you reprioritize. If your family knows we can spend $530 a week on the things we can control, that gives you an immediate framework to see I can't do these things that I did every day and buy groceries and go here on the weekend and do this with the kids on Thursday evening. So I start to be able to see the edges. With credit and overdraft and a million things coming in and out of our bank account, we cannot see the edges. So just starting with that spending habit is really crucial. But if you set a limit and separate it, you don't have to break down the spending habits one by one. You don't have to like, okay, this week I'm not buying coffee, and this week I'm not doing this, and this week I'm not doing that, because just the limit alone will help you reprioritize what each week looks like. So that'd be, the main thing I would say. The other habits where you can automate something, it's around setting a time that you're going to take action. I put things in my calendar. I would set alarms, like make it as obvious as going to pick up your kids. You showed up there, you got food in the house, everyone's still alive. We're clearly capable of setting some sort of agreement with ourselves to take an action. So setting something up in your calendar that today we're going to start doing this. And the same thing can be used to add savings. The same thing can be used to increase an RSP. Another good way to kick off a habit is if you have somebody you can work with directly around your finances. And I would encourage you to look beyond just product people, but people who can give real advice, and they should be able to prove that. Then having an appointment with somebody can sometimes also help you get your ducks in a row, because it puts a deadline in your calendar. And if we don't create our own deadlines for these types of things, nobody else will. Like, we really need that structure. And with structure comes freedom.
What about us? Do you have any suggestions for breaking bad habits?
Yeah, so I love things that we can do that interrupt our thinking. So, some bad habits. So, if you've got the habit of always buying your lunch,
Mhm.
thinking about what might physically disrupt you can be really helpful. So, putting your lunch bag in your way on the way out the door. Back in the day, I would have clients put something physical in their way between them and the exit every day, just for a little while. That would, oh yeah, right, I'm supposed to do this. Objects out of place in your wallet. So one thing we use as an anchor sometimes in cash flow planning is putting something in front of the debit card that just cues them, like, why is that in there? Right, I'm not supposed to do this. Or I have to remember there's only this much in the account. These things seem silly, but they get us out of our autopilot.
Yeah.
We are so inundated with alerts and notifications and everything else. We need these little visual cues that kind of, oh, right. So a playing card in front of the debit card that you're using as your spendable money is really effective, because every time you open your wallet, it's like, oh, right. There's an Olympian that used gold stickers everywhere just to remind him of his goal as he worked his way towards the Olympics. These types of little physical cues, especially when they're out of place, can really help us reset a behavior that we're trying to stop doing.
So I want to go back one more time to talk, because a lot of what people who listen to Make Better Wealth Decisions think about is retirement planning.
Mhm.
And we've already spoken a fair bit about present bias. Have you ever helped people to realize, if you had, say, a 20% increase in your spending in the one line item for your retirement, say from $500 a month to $600 a month, have you ever been able to get people to break their present bias by showing them that at some reasonable expected rate of return, I don't know, 6% over the next 25 or 30 years, 500 a month grows to X and 600 a month grows to some other number, and it might not be 2X, but it might be 1.5X because of the added compounding. What, if anything, can you say about helping people to understand the fairly large impact of what would otherwise be seen as being a fairly nominal increase in their savings rate?
Those illustrating things like those, especially visually, can be helpful, but they're usually not enough to break present bias, because most of the industry is pretty darn good at
Yeah.
showing that over and over and over again. It's easier for people to take action if we focus them on getting short-term goals, and the saving for the long term becomes the side effect. So, but following your cash flow plan, sticking to that $570 a week, you're going to take the kids to Disney in 7 months. And by the time you retire, this change in behavior will add $500,000 to your retirement savings, plus whatever it makes. So that really works. But by itself, That argument, which is very accurate, it's really provable, it's math. That argument, unfortunately, tries to pull on the logic, and the heartstrings always work better when we're trying to change behavior. So I think it can be a factor, but I think by itself, if that was effective, we probably wouldn't be talking about this today, because there's a million people that can prove that's true. What you're saying is accurate, but it doesn't always work. There are other decisions, though, that we make that affect our behavior that don't have anything to do with present bias. And that is something also, if you're working your way towards retirement, you definitely want to watch yourself for. The other main one I was going to mention is hurting. So a lot of times, and you probably see this a lot when you're working with clients, we're always looking, our brain doesn't want to make every single decision all day long. If we actually sat down and thought everything through, we couldn't function. Just think about driving, right? You get in the car, you've got your seatbelt on and your foot on the brake, and you started the car. You've done 32 things without even thinking about it. But when you first learned, you're like, okay, buckle, and then do this, and then do that. And so when it comes to our finances, a lot of individual people who aren't in the industry, some of the financial decisions feel like that. Okay, buckle up and just do this step. And it feels really, really overwhelming. So we do something called herding, where we look for evidence of the decision, what other people made, and then we figure that must be the best thing, so we'll copy it. So I would say another major decision I see people making as they head towards retirement, besides not saving enough, is not questioning their debt structure choices enough. Signing on the 5-year fixed rate because everyone else is doing that. There's no evidence to support that a 5-year fixed rate is better for anybody. But if
Taking
there is
CPP early is one of the ones that I see all the time.
that one drives me,
Right.
bananas. That one is so bad. And yeah, once upon a time there was a crossover, but it's not there anymore. And too many people are betting their retirement on dying really young in retirement. And that's not a bet you want to make, because you don't actually have any control. But yeah, that type of decision where we think that's what everyone else is doing, so therefore we can shortcut this decision because it's exhausting on our brain. When it's the big financial decisions, like when to take CPP, when to take OAS, what mortgage to take, whether I refinance my debt or not, don't shortcut those. Catch yourself. Because if the next time your mortgage comes up for renewal, or if you're sitting there looking at, you've got a mortgage and a credit card balance and a line of credit, it is totally reasonable and could be in your best interest to actually look at what changing that structure, refinancing, would do to your ability to save more for retirement and pay your debt down faster. Interest rates is another one. Everyone can tell that 3 is less than 4, but that doesn't say what the debt costs. And asking our lenders, show me the total payback cost on this, and looking at what the total payback cost does on the things that you're not refinancing, that can really open your eyes. So just being aware of those tendencies to try and shortcut those financial decisions, because it's easier, but sometimes it's real dangerous and expensive.
This has been wonderful. I want to wrap this up by asking you the way I always ask people at the end. This is about making better wealth decisions. If you could offer one bit of advice to the listeners today, what advice would you give them as a cash flow expert that would help them make better wealth decisions?
I think the one thing I would say, and I've talked about it a little bit already, is to separate that day-to-day spending. It gives you the capacity to save more, which gives you the ability to put more into your wealth. And if you're putting more away, you have more ability to accept the risk tolerance that might be most suitable for you. A lot of us are taking more risk than we mean to be, maybe trying to make up for not saving enough. So that focus on separating that day-to-day spending, I think, can be a huge wealth builder.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. This has been wonderful. I want to thank you for your time today, and I want to wish you all the best down the road.
Thanks so much, John.
John DeGooey is a portfolio manager with Design Securities in Toronto. The views expressed in this program are not to be construed as specific advice. It is recommended that you consult a qualified advisor before taking action. His books, The Professional Financial Advisor 4, Stand Up to the Financial Services Industry, and Bullshift are available through Amazon and in bookstores throughout Canada. You can reach John at 647-STAND-UP. That's 647-782-6387, or at jdegooey@designedsecurities.ca.